Hello there, my name is Louise and thank you for joining me in this session about mindfulness and resilience in secondary school students. Just bear with me a moment, I'm going to share my screen and then we can start the session. Okay, so I'm running this session on behalf of Oxford University Press and their IB diploma programme. As I mentioned, my name is Louise Aukland and here's just a little bit more about me. So I have been a secondary science teacher for 15 years approximately, and within a lot of that time working on PSHE or social and emotional learning, leading in the classroom and as a coordinator across school. And a few years ago, I left full-time teaching to become a researcher, joining the Oxford University Department of Psychiatry. And I currently work with the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Unit, where I've been working on the Myriad trial, looking at mindfulness in schools, and for them running also public engagement activities, developing resources for schools around resilience, around mental health, and around mindfulness. And I now work on a project to do with neuroscience curricula in schools. I also run my own freelance work under Minecraft Consulting, where I teach mindfulness to young people and to adults. So that's a little bit about me and my background. So let's move on to what we're talking about today. Here's a bit of an outline for our session. We'll be looking at the current situation and what that really means for schools and young people and some of the issues that may have arisen from that. And then leading on to the idea of resilience. What do we mean by resilience and how is it particularly relevant at the moment? We'll then look at teenagers and how we can maybe go about building resilience in teenagers as teachers or staff and adults that work in schools. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Myriad project, which is researching mindfulness in schools. So we'll look at some of the misconceptions around mindfulness, what it is and what it is not. We'll then go on to look at the possibilities for mindfulness and linking it with building resilience, which is the research project that I've been working on. But I'll also be suggesting some of the small practices that you can do with teenagers. And if this were the live session, we'd be trying those out, but I'll maybe make some suggestions as to where you can go to find out more about that. So let's begin by having a think about what normal everyday is really for students at IB schools. And this picture I actually took from the IB homepage, so showing students interacting in an interesting and informative, fun way, working around a computer. But as we're all very aware, really, the world is a different place and has been for quite a few months now. And if we think about what that means for young people and their learning environment, it's become quite different under COVID. Okay, so let's have a think about how. Well, there's been a great deal of change and uncertainty. So initially that change from maybe teaching in the classroom to students finding themselves having to learn from home, online learning, or even mixed learning. And this goes for staff as well, not just the young people. So masses of changes in the way in which their everyday life is run. And then we have uncertainty. So all of those things that are changing and there's unknowns going forwards. And we'll talk a bit more about going forwards in a moment. So that future uncertainty, the thoughts about, will we be assessed? What will our assessments look like? What will the exams look like? And I think these all add increased stresses really both on teaching staff and young people, not knowing what's coming in the months ahead. And sometimes not even knowing what's happening next week. Will I be in school next week or will I be home or will I be part? And isolation. Isolation is an interesting one for teenagers in particular, because this period of their life, this adolescence time, it's really important for their brain development that they interact successfully with peers. In fact, they're much more influential really than the adults in their lives during this period. And as we know, many of them have found themselves isolated at home, working by themselves, or only interacting via a screen. And so a real shift or a change from their usual peer and friendship interactions. And so again, this can have quite an impact on the well-being and the everyday life really of young people. Thank goodness for technology in this sense, in that if we were looking 20 years ago, it would be a very different picture for young people in isolation. And then we've got these stresses that might come from socioeconomic fears. So will my family still have a job? Will I be able to afford to live where I live? Will I be able to get a job myself in a few years' time? What does the global pandemic mean for me going forwards? And these may well be ideas and thoughts that are going around in the heads of young people at the moment or over the last few months. And finally, we have those contamination fears themselves. So here we are in a global pandemic. Will I get this disease? Will I cause other people? Will I transmit it to other people? And there's the potential for quite a few thoughts and fears around contamination and getting the disease itself and what that might mean for young people, their families and loved ones. Obviously, all of these things also apply to the staff and the teachers working in schools. And this is why it's not really surprising that when the OUP team did a little bit of research with IB teachers on what it's like to be remote teaching and learning during the pandemic, and then some follow-up interviews afterwards as to what things are right now like, the findings seem to sort of reflect the situation that I've just taken us through. And if we have a look at some of the pull-out findings from those surveys, we see that really students themselves are very concerned about cancelled exams or internal assessments. Again, that lack of social interaction that I mentioned, and often very low engagement and motivation, so not really wanting to get involved. I see it myself in my own children. Okay, and we might be able to reflect on it ourselves in the workplace. Okay, it can be quite hard to engage with all these changes. So then we've also got this gap in knowledge, possibly. So the reduced content coverage, whether that's because they've been working from home or they've been isolating, or whether just due to schools closing down, there's just been the lack of real consistent approach to keeping up with that content delivery. So making young people less prepared for their DP or for university. And that feeling of unprepared or not engaged or motivated can really have some impacts on the well-being of the young people that we work with. And so how about staff? Let's have a look at some staff findings. So teachers were feeding back to us that there are shifting demands, the distance and blended learning. And so these have changed really from what the everyday job used to be. And those demands are often putting people outside of their skill zone. And they're missing really the reasons why they went into teaching, to engage with young people, the face-to-face teaching environment and the buzz that comes with being in the classroom in that sort of atmosphere. And of course, we have to remember that for many IB teachers, that also means no home visits because travel has been very limited, which can have its own impact on the well-being and knock-on impacts on the work-life balance for those teachers in schools. So let's shift for a moment and start thinking about resilience and building resilience to manage uncertainty. And when I mention the word resilience, I just want you to take a few moments to think, what words pop into your head? What do you think of when you think of resilience? And obviously, if this was the live session, I'd be getting you to share these ideas with me. What sort of words might come into your head when we think of resilience? But instead, let's take a look at one of the definitions that you might find if you were to look up the word resilience. So here we have the ability to recover from or adjust easily to adversity or change. Now, we've just been talking quite a bit about the changes that are taking place and how for some people those changes might be causing particularly adverse conditions. So a lot more work or different types of work or mental stresses around that work, which means that it's just harder to engage with it. So really, if this is what resilience is, then perhaps that's an area that we could look at and better understand. And this word cloud that I'm showing you here is really represented from some work that we've done with young people before, where we talked about resilience, and I asked them to think of what do we think of when we talk about resilience, and all of these words came up, and they're quite varied in there. We've got things like confidence, self-motivated, and responsibilities. So some of these things that we might be building looking at skills development, but also then you've got your meditation or relaxation, connections and sleep. So a whole range of ideas around resilience and what it might mean to young people. And it's purely coincidental that the middle word positive has come out in large text there. I didn't intend that to be the case. But actually it is quite a positive income, because the resilience science knows quite a bit about how we can build this in young people. Resilience is not something we're necessarily born with. While some people might have more resilience at birth than others as a result of genetic factors, resilience is something that is very influenced by experiences and the environment. And the good news is, the positive news, is that we can build resilience in young people and in adults by building the skills that help to support it, but also working with secure and positive relationships and supportive relationships. So people that have those relationships around them and are able to learn new skills are more likely to be resilient in the face of adversity and change. And the research project that I've been working on for a number of years now is Myriad. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Myriad. My Resilience in Adolescence is what it stands for. And so we're focusing on looking at resilience in young people, but from the angle of mindfulness, whether mindfulness can help us to build resilience in young people. So a little bit about Myriad, the project itself. It is a Wellcome Strategic Award, so we're funded by the Wellcome Trust, and it is a UK schools focused project. However, it is the biggest trial of its kind currently looking at mindfulness in schools, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a bit later. And it is looking in particular at those underlying cognitive mechanisms, the teacher training routes, and a school-based implementation and effectiveness of mindfulness training in UK secondary schools. So what was the reason for Willem Kuyken at the Oxford Mindfulness Centre and Department of Psychiatry for looking at this particular area in the first place? Well, the background of the group very much looks at anxiety and depression. And if we look at some of the onset of common mental health disorders, in particularly those anxiety disorders, then we see that the average age of onset of them is between the ages of about 11 and 15, so around 14 years of age. And as a result of that, the group started to think, is there something that we could do from a preventative point of view to support to reduce the long-term effects? In fact, the hypothesis, the central question to the research project is this: has mindfulness training in adolescence the potential to shift the secondary school age population away from psychopathology? So that's this idea that young people actually develop anxiety and depression and are diagnosed with that. And can we shift them away from that and towards improved mental health by addressing the key processes of mental regulation and executive control that operate across the spectrum of risk and resilience? So those are two of the executive sort of ideas, the brain-based ideas, mechanisms that we're looking at, and whether using mindfulness we can improve those to improve the well-being of young people and prevent the onset of some of these mental health disorders. So that's the idea. So there are actually 4 different projects to it. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but we have the underlying mechanisms run by teams in Cambridge, Sarah Jane Blakemore and Tim Dalgleish. We've got the main randomized controlled trial, that's project 3, bottom left there. That's the mindfulness trial that I've been working on out of Oxford and the Willem Kuyken. And then we've got some teacher training ones that were also out of Oxford but are now complete, looking at how we support and train teachers. And then there's the prospect for longer term cohort studies. But obviously we've also had the added complication of the COVID pandemic that's been thrown into the mix for us as well as researchers. So things have slightly changed since this slide was developed. But thinking about the randomized controlled trial, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just some key facts about the research that we've been looking at. It is UK schools, again, very wide ranging in terms of that's quite a large number that have been involved, 50-50 for the trial, looking at mindfulness teaching versus a teaching as usual. So that's a social emotional learning teaching in school. Comparing against a baseline, we've got pre, post, and 1 or 2 year follow-up, although that's changed recently with COVID. approximately 30,000 at baseline, 5,000 followed through. That's students, that is. And our outcomes are looking at risk for depression, well-being scores, and social emotional behavioural functioning. So that is what we're measuring. Now, I would love to be able to share results with you, but right now we don't have them. We're still in the process of analysing those and trying to think about the impact that COVID may have had on the research. But keep your eyes open and ears open. That may well be later in 2021 or early 2022. So we shall see when that is. Alongside this, and this is something that teachers may be more interested in, because these are some of the resources that I developed with the team that we were working with in Myriad, are some interactive schools resources around neuroscience, mental health and well-being, project-based work that might be great for getting young people to do their own research and engaging with psychological sciences, and they can all be found at that website there. Okay. So let's just step back for a moment and think about mindfulness. And I'd be asking for a little bit more feedback for you if this was a live session, but it's not. So I'm going to run through what mindfulness is. We tend to think of mindfulness is about noticing what is happening moment to moment. So it's very much this awareness, building an awareness or just noticing what is happening. It's a way of training attention. And I always say to young people, gosh, how many times are you asked to pay attention? And how many times are you taught to pay attention? And mindfulness is just one way that we can teach young people to pay attention and know when they're not paying attention, just building that awareness. It also has this attitudinal aspect to it. So a way of developing curiosity, openness, and a less judgmental attitude. So when we're practicing it, it's very much about not judging ourselves for what's right or what's wrong. It's just noticing what is happening moment to moment. It can be a very useful life skill, and there have been known improvements for people in their life as to where they can apply it and how they can apply it. And that will be dependent on the individual as to how useful they find that. It is evidence-based, and I will touch on the evidence in a moment. And for some people, it can actually be a whole way of being, so they can incorporate the practices into their daily life and their daily routine and the ways they interact with people and complete their work and tasks and family life. So I would like to just quickly cover what mindfulness is not, because having worked in this field for a number of years, I'm very aware of all the misconceptions and often cliches around it that are not necessarily true. So let's just have a quick look at some of those. So mindfulness is not religious is a slightly contentious statement to make, because it does have a religious base to it. And this is something that you're welcome to look up. Willem Kijken, who has just produced a wonderful book with Christina Feldman on looking at the religious origins of mindfulness in Buddhism, and also then looking at Western psychology and how the two have met. And so mindfulness does not need to be taught with a religious context. In fact, many of the school programs are secular and they don't have a religious slant at all. However, it does have a base, its roots in Buddhism. Mindfulness is not necessarily yoga. Many young people think that it is yoga when I talk to them for the first time. It is not necessarily yoga. However, yoga can be done using mindful techniques and mindful approaches, okay? And in fact, in the early practices, there's a very close connection there, but it does not necessarily mean it is just yoga. The way in which we teach it in schools means it's not therapy. Mindfulness can be used for therapy, but it does not have to be therapy. It can just be a way of practicing being present at any moment with a particular attitude. Is it boring? Well, it can be boring for some people, but then that's all part of noticing the boringness. In fact, I often say to people, it's not necessarily relaxing. So for some people, practicing mindfulness can actually be quite difficult, quite a challenge and quite hard. So associating the boring and relaxing, let's approach it with that more open-minded curiosity and say, well, let's see what it's like. Sometimes it might be boring, sometimes it might be relaxing. It depends on many other factors. Is it just breathing? I was once asked by a boy in a school, what, you've come all the way here to just tell us how to breathe. We already know how to do that. Well, that's a fair point. We do talk quite a lot about breathing when we practice mindfulness, but it isn't just breathing. Breathing is just a helpful tool and a helpful focus for our attention when we're practicing. Is it always the solution? No, there will sometimes be other things that are needed. And for some young people, particularly those that might be having a particular crisis, mindfulness may not be for them. It might be something else. Or for someone that's particularly decided it won't be for them, then they probably won't necessarily get many benefits from it. So it's not always the solution to every problem. However, let's have a think about the evidence behind it. This is what some of the evidence is saying, that really a lot of the adult studies have been looked at for a whole range of contexts. We've got anxiety, stress and depression, but also in other areas like irritable bowel, diet management, interactions and so on. So let's just have a look what it says for anxiety, stress and depression, because that's what our group particularly focuses on. So we have seen a moderate decrease in symptoms. Again, this is in adults, as effective as other evidence-based treatment, and actually has stronger effects than non-evidence-based treatments that it's been compared to. And there's a lot of evidence that backs it up. And if you're particularly interested in the evidence side of things, it may be worth looking up the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, which the Myriad Project is part of their research. And from there, the Oxford Mindfulness Centre website, you'll be able to read about a lot of the research that underpins the mindfulness for adults. But in children, there's actually not been so much. So this is just a selection of some of the studies that have been done in children, in young people, in schools. So there are a few studies, but I'm just going to summarize them here. So they're broadly encouraging. There is a feasibility and an acceptability about programs in schools. Mostly we're looking at robust effects, particularly in this sort of area around depression and anxiety, stress. However, there's not a lot of strong connections with academic or behavioural outcomes as yet. Although, as I say, we're only looking in the past few years, 10 years or so, in terms of there's being a massive ramp up of evidence trying to look in schools. And really, we're all quite looking forward, rather tentatively, to the results of the Myriad trial, because we all know how complex school systems can be, as to what we see there, whether there's any additional interesting ideas that come out of the research there, because it's going to have been the largest trial into mindfulness in schools. Because to date, as I mentioned, so most of them have been very small in schools, and generally summed up really there quite well with enthusiasm outweighs the evidence before this trial. So we're hoping that with our work, we might be able to contribute something more to the research community. Okay, so let's move away and start thinking about the practice of mindfulness with young people themselves. There's a whole list of practices here, and I'm just going to talk briefly through them and maybe think about some practical things that you might want to do in schools. With the program that we've worked with Myriad, the teachers have gone through quite thorough training in order to teach mindfulness to teenagers. And really, many people would argue that unless you're fully aware of what mindfulness is and the techniques that are being used, it can be worth using a pre-recorded practice to introduce mindfulness to young people, or little videos and so on that can be used. So I'm just going to take you through some of the practices that the young people and teenagers that I've worked with in class and we've worked with Myriad have done. So that top one there, just stopping and breathing. So in a busy day, doing something, doing a task, just stop and breathe. And remember, it's about focusing attention in a kind and open way as to what's happening in each breath. And in the Myriad study, we used the mindfulness in schools curriculum around mindfulness teaching, and that's called .B. So that's the program, and this is one of their main practices there. So .B. In an adult mindfulness course, that may well be called a breathing space. It's a very similar practice. Then we have variations on breathing, because breathing is very helpful to young people to focus on at certain times. Sometimes it's not the best place to focus on, and I'll come to that in a moment. But with breathing, there are other things we can do. We can do a 7-11. That's where we count to 7 as we breathe in, and we count to 11 as we breathe out in our head, not necessarily forcing the breath to match the counting, but matching the counting to the breathing, the natural breathing. And you've got square breathing. Quite a few of my students enjoy that one. Breathing in for say 4, count of 4, or count of 3, count of 5, whichever one it is. But you breathe in for that number, you hold your breath for that number, you breathe out for that number, you hold your breath for that number. And then the other one, which is one of this is my favorite and has a favorite with my son, and my recent course, this was the best feedback. So we do finger breathing. So we breathe in as we follow the finger up, and we breathe out as we go down. We breathe in, we breathe out, we breathe in, we breathe out, we breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. And then you start again. And in fact, I've seen students sitting in exams before now, sitting and under the table. I can see them doing this with their fingers under the table before they start their exam. Just a quick breathing space using finger breathing. So a sitting practice, we're all sitting down at various times. This can be done anywhere, anytime. And this is about, the FOFBOK is the .B practice and stands for feet on floor, bottom on chair. And then the sitting practice is quite helpful often at, when things are a bit more stressful, it can be hard to focus on the breath. So it's quite nice there to just try and focus the attention, or to keep the attention on the feet or the bottom on the chair, the feet on the floor or the bottom on the chair. Then we've got the body scan, and a body scan comes in many different types of mindfulness courses. The one in the .B course, the MIST program that we use, is called meditation. And then next one, mindful eating. So really noticing sounds. So that one could be done just sitting with the eyes closed and just noticing sounds and their textures and their tones. Again, with seeing, mindful seeing. So filtering all of the things that we notice through our sense of sight. Mindful movement, so some stretching or walking. And that could be linked in there with yoga if people wanted to. Stepping back from thoughts. So that's these last three here, these two here, stepping back from thoughts and dealing with difficulty, are really for young people once they've done some of the more introductory practices, because we're starting to look at more difficult things now, thought patterns and repeated thought patterns, or dealing with difficult emotions or sensations in the body. And then finally, that gratitude practice, or savouring the good. Again, so these are practices that start thinking about what are we thankful for in life and how can we savour those very small things. So these are some of the practices that are incorporated into the curriculum that we've been teaching through Myriad and teaching with young people, and you'll see them in quite a few different mindfulness curriculum areas. So that brings us to the end of this session. Now, obviously, if we were live again, we would talk a little bit more and have an opportunity for questions, and we would have been able to maybe try out one of the practices, one of the introductory practices. But if you do want to know more about the work that we've been doing at Myriad, please do look up the Oxford Mindfulness Centre or the Myriad project to find out more, and there's lots of information and links from there for you if you would like them. Okay, and meanwhile, if you are able to and happy to, there is an opportunity to give some feedback from this webinar. So you can scan your QR code using your phone in order to fill that out. And so I will leave that up for a few moments just to give you that opportunity. But meanwhile, would like to say thank you very much for listening to this webinar. I hope you found it enjoyable and interesting and can take something away from it for your own practice, your teaching practice going forwards. Thank you very much.